Today on Substance Stories, we're going to be talking about the problem with prohibition. So today I want to talk about the problem with prohibition, right? Because we are in this state of prohibition. Basically, all drugs in the world are illegal, all sort of psychotropic drugs in the world are illegal, with the exception of caffeine, alcohol, tobacco, and in some areas, cannabis, right? Everything else is basically illegal. So how did we get here? Well, historically, it was really led by the economic interests, um, country and economic and political interests. So people were concerned about the influence of drugs and what it could do, and people were trying to make the drugs that they made legal and the drugs that other people made illegal. So, for instance, the Treaty of Versailles was when Germany signed on to the Convention of 1914 that made a lot of opioids illegal because Germany was making a ton of opioids and didn't want to ruin their opioid industry, right? So then, another example is in 1972, there was a convention that really made all sort of hallucinogens and illegal. And that was the Nixon government really concerned about the sort of hippie movement and the effect, that could cause voters to vote less conservatively. But, in answer to that, there's an advert from Sandoz who make LSD, which would listed as a side effect that LSD could cause, political upheaval. So if I was, a government and someone's advertising a drug that they're saying, oh, this could cause a revolution, I'd be like, well, this drug obviously can't exist. So I think we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the people at the time. So it's obviously been a mistake that prohibition happened, but there were understandable reasons. So why does it? But obviously financial reasons as well. And there's no, obviously the countries that consume all the drugs don't really get punished by prohibition as much as the countries that make the drug. And obviously the most powerful countries in the world, like America and Europe, they're the ones that are consuming the drugs, and the less powerful, poorer countries in the world, like a lot of Asian and Middle Eastern countries and South American countries, are making the drugs, and they're getting punished by this. So it's all very convenient for sort of socio-political reasons on a sort of global scale why prohibition exists. But I think we also need to keep in mind that the people that are advocating for prohibition, they want to stop harms from drugs. They see drugs destroy lives, or they see addiction destroy lives, and they want that to stop. They want people to be happier and healthier. The problem with prohibition is it doesn't work. So the perfect example is if, heroin is illegal in Australia, and if I am importing heroin into Australia and you get really good, the police get really good at stopping me from importing heroin, but the same amount of people are still using heroin. So functionally, what had happened, let's say I could get 100 kilos in, and there were all these people that wanted, heroin was like $10 a kilo or however much. If you got really good at stopping me from importing heroin, all you've done is drive up demand, and suddenly heroin's $100 or $200 a kilo, and then I've got even more incentive. Obviously, those numbers are way too small, but the point is, the better we are at policing prohibition and not treating people. So if we police supply but don't police demand, if we don't stop demand, all we are doing is driving up the price of the drug and further incentivizing people to bring that drug into the country or to make that drug. So the problem with prohibition is it doesn't stop harms. In fact, in many ways, it can increase harms, because it's unregulated market. So people are, drug dealer has no issue selling to children, where our bottle shop wouldn't sell to children. So we're, then the adulterated substances, a lot of deaths from a lot of drugs is because people aren't using the drugs they think they're using, or they're using in strengths they don't know. So that's the problem with prohibition. The problem with prohibition is its main goal is to prevent harms from drugs, but it's actually increasing harm from drugs, right? So what is our option? What should we be doing instead? Well, there are lots of different options. It's not as simple as just saying legalize. What we learned from countries that have legalized drugs, or specifically we can learn from cannabis, is there tends to actually be an increase in the use of cannabis, which if we're looking to limit harms from drugs is probably not good. So maybe we could decriminalize, but the problem is that still sort of keeps the illegal industry alive, and there's a lot of harms related from the gangs and importing who turf wars from drugs. So that's also not right. So I don't have a solution. I should imagine it would be probably some sort of highly controlled, legalized process. But I think what we need to come together with is the current prohibition system is not helping. It's not making anyone better. In fact, it's increasing harms. One of the things I really hate when this is discussed, you see people like Carl Hart, who's written a very popular book called, An Adult Conversation About Drugs or something like that, is it's an interesting read, but Carl Hart neglects to talk about any of the harms from drugs when he talks about it. He's an active substance user, and he just thinks substances are great and we should all be allowed to use substances, which I think from an American, freedom perspective, fair enough. But from a sort of more reasonable, we want to prevent the harms from addiction perspective is a ridiculous thing to write. Making drugs completely legal in an unregulated system would increase the harms from drugs, but the current system is also causing a lot of unnecessary harm. And what we can do is we can look at sort of our already existing addictive, like legal systems that are addictive. So gambling in Australia, for instance, or alcohol in Australia. So we have a lot of limitations on how you can sell alcohol and how you can advertise tobacco in Australia, but there's basically nothing on gambling in Australia. And the results are we gamble basically more than anyone else on the planet. So we can learn these lessons about what should be done about prohibition from how we're treating addictive behaviours and addictive substances now. And so probably the answer is something like tobacco, which Australia is really good at policing, and we've got really low rates of tobacco with high tax and banning advertising and plain packages and that sort of thing. So I guess the what needs to be held onto whenever we're having these sort of conversations is what we should be trying to do is prevent harms from these addictive substances. It's not about freedom, it's not about everyone's individual right to make bad decisions. It's about trying to create a system where from a public health perspective, the best outcomes happen. If supply control worked, like if making drugs illegal meant that less people would use drugs and it would be safer, then I'd be advocating for that. But the problem with prohibition is that it doesn't work and makes the harms worse. So hopefully that arms you for the next time you have dinner with your very conservative uncle and this conversation comes up. Thank you for listening.